Since its inception in the 80s, MTV has gone through a million different changes. What began as a channel strictly focused on music very quickly evolved with the advent of the internet, as well as the rising popularity of reality TV, and eventually became a channel focused on entertaining young adults, with music as a bonus. How they did this exactly changes vastly depending on the decade. In the 90s, it was through a slew of animation, namely shows like Liquid Television, where Beavis and Butthead began, as well as its superior spin-off Daria. There's Downtown, as well as the stop-motion Celebrity Deathmatch. It's the second time I've mentioned that show this year. In the 2000s, it was through reality shows. Most of the popular ones have been talked about to death on YouTube, like Next, Parental Control, Room Raiders, and eventually the one and only Jersey Shore. But in the early 2010s, before Catfish would take off, before fucking Teen Mom and a bunch of 16 and Pregnant seasons, their focus was on scripted television, mainly comedies and dramas. This is the decade that gave us shows like Awkward, love that show with all my heart, Scream, Zack Stone is gonna be famous, Teen Wolf, and that's about it. Or at least that's all that's been remembered, since MTV would go back to the reality TV well once these shows ended. Mind you, this channel has always had a history of canceling shows prematurely, only to sweep them under the rug, and I gotta say that there is no show that's been more collectively erased than their 2011 series, Skins. It's actually a lie. There's other shows that are even less remembered after their cancellations, like I Just Want My Pants Back, which is an insane title, or Death Valley, which was a horror mockumentary about a police division, which just does not fit the demographic of the channel whatsoever. If you're not me, and were actually well versed in pop culture at that time, then the name Skins might ring a bell, since it was originally a British teen drama that began airing in 2007. You see, the 2010s had a sort of pseudo-third British invasion going on. Instead, it wasn't solely done through music, but through television as well. This is something Mila Tequila brought up in her comprehensive video on One Direction, and I could not agree more. Throughout this decade, some of the most popular shows online were either British, think Doctor Who, Sherlock, The Inbetweeners, or were remakes of British series like Shameless, The Office, and Veep. Kind of, sort of, regardless of where it began, there was a general fascination with British culture in the air that I think definitely played into why Skins became so popular so fast stateside. It also helps that it's just a blatantly well-made show. To explain the original UK Skins, it was, to put it lightly, everything that most teen dramas aspire to be yet have always failed to attain. The first two seasons focused on a specific group of friends, but the interesting part about Skins was how it juggled all of its story threads. Each different episode is focused on a specific member of the group to flesh out both their home lives as well as their personal struggles. But in between all of it, there are more ongoing plot threads like the love triangle between Tony, Michelle, Sid, and Cassie, or Chris's really weird thing for his teacher, Angie, all of which are given some sort of progress. So on the offhand, an episode doesn't really gel with you, there's still a bit of satisfaction sitting through the 43-minute runtime. The biggest thing that separates Skins from other shows is not all the nudity and creative cursing from Peter Capaldi, but the willingness to tell a uniquely captivating story. Each character and their tragic backstory, be it emotionally distant parents, toxic living situations, complete parental abandonment, drugs, as well as eating disorders, are all allowed to be just as all-encompassing and unfair as they are in real life. Most of their problems aren't just fixed in one episode, or even get solved at all. The show really manages to make you feel like some of these characters might not make it to the light at the end of the tunnel, which just allows you to savor those nice moments all the more. It's a very British way to tackle a teen drama, and it's not an exaggeration to say that I've really never seen any other show that's executed like it. The first season released from January to March of 2007, and while none of its episodes outside of the pilot surpassed 1 million viewers, the show was a critical success, and its cliffhanger ending struck a major chord with the fan base. Also, spoilers for both the American and British shows, obviously. Skins became such a success with audiences and critics that, by 2009, in the midst of the third season airing, MTV ordered the American version to be made. One with the involvement of the father-son duo who created and wrote the original series, Brian Elsley and Jamie Britton respectively. Except, even with half of the episodes being written by either one of them, even with the presumed massive amount of money put into both production and marketing, the show would be swiftly cancelled mere months after its final episode aired. However, it's a bit more complicated than most fans' answer of "the show sucked." Yeah, over the years, MTV Skins has gained a reputation of being labeled as a subpar show, especially when compared to the original series. A reputation that's still very prevalent now, 13 years later, with retrospectives online. And it's here where I like to make it clear. My goal is not to rag on the remake and uplift the original. I don't think you need to hear someone else saying how good Skins is for 30 minutes or something. I actually went to great lengths to avoid comparing and contrasting the two by only watching the first half of Series 1 of Skins, just in order to get a feel for the original, then viewing the entirety of MTV Skins, just so I didn't compare and contrast the entire time, only to return to the original so I still have an understanding of the source material. And the video was in production so long that I actually also had to rewatch the MTV show as well. And all of this was done to avoid basing both my appreciation and complaints with the MTV show solely on the original series. And after doing so, my feelings are more complicated. I will go out on a limb and say that the first episode of MTV Skins is absolutely terrible, mainly since it is a shot-for-shot, word-for-word remake of the UK show. And I cannot tell you how terrible of an idea this is, especially since the MTV show was not marketed as a direct remake, but instead an adaptation, which is backed up by our ensemble cast. Almost all of them are direct parallels to the original show, with names and slight personality traits being altered, which is really weird. It's not like the UK show had just outrageously British names like Barnaby. If the goal of the MTV show is to differentiate itself from the original for an American audience and tell a new interpretation, you don't want to start that with the exact same fucking pilot. Not only is the material unoriginal, but the delivery is rough. It's almost like watching a high school theater production of UK Skins. Something I'd like to state up front, one, I don't blame the teen actors since this was most of their first starring roles, and making fun of child actors is lame as hell to do. And two, the same stiff delivery can be felt with the adult actors as well. Maybe the directors weren't used to working with the subject matter, maybe the actors weren't entirely comfortable with the material, or it could also be how little time the production was given. MTV ordered a Skins remake in August of 2009, and the cast were all hired by Christmas Eve that year. Production began in summer of 2010, and the pilot premiered in January of 2011, and the show was cancelled by July. So it's not ridiculous to say that there wasn't a ton of time for the cast to work on chemistry. But regardless, you can feel it through the screen, and not just this first episode, but episodes 2 and 3 as well. You compare this to MTV's other programming from this era like Awkward, or even other cancelled series like Zack Stone, there's always going to be growing pains, especially with the pilot, but with all the other shows that the network had on, there's a clear direction and sense of energy, which is something that this series premiere lacks. Why the show decided to essentially do a word-for-word remake of the original for episodes 1 and 3 only makes no sense. Maybe the thought was that the episodes are so iconic that changing them wouldn't feel right, but all it does is rob MTV Skins a chance of resonating as something different in the minds of the fans of the original, which, at this point, was pretty much everybody who'd seen that show. The problem with MTV Skins is not that it tries to adapt a story that's already been told on television, it's that it does the exact opposite. It's just regurgitating it in Canadian. Yeah, the show's Canadian, I forgot to say that. It doesn't help that the second episode is billed as this entirely new story about Taya, the resident lesbian of the group who replaces Maxine in the original, yet that's a fucking lie since it still mainly adapts storylines and character motivations from the original show. Since the first episode is the same, Stan, who's based on Sid, still owns a drug dealer $900 for the weed that ends up in the harbor at the end of the pilot. Except, cut to episode 2, this is clearly a plot thread that the writers wanted gone ASAP. The opening is a direct recreation of UK episode 2, Cassie, where the drug dealer shows up at the gang's school under the pretense of being a substitute teacher and threatens Stan. Except, this episode completely ignores that plot thread and Stan is never seen for the rest of the episode in order to make way for the A-plot of Taya and Tony falling for each other, which, you know, is its own can of worms, only for the drug dealer who's named Ladong, by the way. In the original show, he's named Mad Twatter, but in the American show, they try to be be funny to name him Ladong. It just doesn't hit the same. Only for Ladong to show up at the very end of the episode, out of nowhere, recreating a scene from episode 3, Jol, where he threatens Taya. Only the scene is cut short by her father showing up, condensing the sequence of events that occurs in Jol's episode. I know I said that my goal was not to compare and contrast, and that's still true, but the decision to half adapt the UK show is frustrating. Not out of some respect I have towards the source material, but because it ultimately makes the MTV series a worse show. All of Ladong's scenes are cut unusually short, not letting him have any screen presence whatsoever, so he's not allowed to be all that funny, and he's not sold as a legitimate threat to the main cast. So him being taken care of off screen by Taya's dad doesn't hit as hard as it does in the original, and it feels more like a random character that was given a bit too much meaningless screen time. Why are you forcing me to compare these, MTV? Why the fuck did you recreate the original show in the first damn place? You could argue that Ladong is not meant to be an adversary in this interpretation, instead just a humorous villain, which would be fine. But in that case, he still fails, because he's never given enough time to be funny. Why the fuck is he even here then? He truly serves absolutely no purpose here whatsoever. My goal is not to make a Venn diagram of the two shows, but to ask why these decisions to adapt certain characters and plot lines are being made outside of it being what we expect, especially when what's original to the show ends up suffering. Taya might have a similar plot line to Max, where she ends up having an affair with Tony behind Michelle's back, but she is a completely different character. Taya has a sporadic home life, she has a weird superiority complex with her romantic partners, much like Tony does, which is what ultimately leads to the two of them starting a pseudo-relationship. Or there's Taya's connection with her grandma, who had a closeted partner when she was younger, but due to societal expectations, the two of them couldn't be together. None of these are really given the time that they deserve in Taya's episode, making it a really weird watch where nothing gets the time it deserves despite having a 43-minute runtime. Yeah, for some reason the American show maintained the 43-minute runtime, which makes no fucking sense. Episode 2 has the possibility of being interesting, but still ultimately misses the mark. And like I said, episode 3 Chris is a near word-for-word, shot-for-shot remake of its UK counterpart. Again. Thanks, I hate it. The only major difference is that Chris has had little to no screen time in the US version so far, which sort of shoots the episode in the foot before it even starts, because the reveal that his family was that broken in the UK show came as a major shock, whereas here, the reveal hits far less. Except, credit where credit's due, the ending is very different. The characters are the same age, but since British schooling is so fucking weird, the MTV Skins cast are in high school still and not college. So Chris ends up having to live with Tina, his psychology teacher who he's in love with, as opposed to just being given room and board through the school. Which just makes it all the more sad to watch him go from one difficult home situation to another, and ends up tying into his storyline further down the line. Plus, you can actually feel the main cast subtly into their roles by this point in the series. I highly doubt that the show was shot sequentially, but it's no denying that this is a major upgrade from the pilot. The ensemble scenes feel a lot more alive, the comedy is snappier, the scene where Chris attempts to return the sound system is honestly leagues better than the original. Same with his scene with the squatter. I think the execution of the scene between Chris and his stepmom is done exceptionally well. Tension in the room is palpable as the audience quickly picks up on just how much Chris's father doesn't care about him. It's also one of the few well-done examples of working around television restrictions in order to make something better than just a sloppy adaptation for the scene where Chris drops his baby brother. And it's here, finally, where MTV Skins decides to make big changes. You know, after only 3 40-minute episodes. While episode 4, Katie, might start as a remake of her UK counterpart Cassie's episode, it ends up going in a completely different direction, making her parents a lot more outwardly neglectful and honestly malicious, as well as using her perspective to tell a story where both Katie and the audience begin to question what's real and what isn't. Katie was a standout in episode 1, being the only character truly distinct from her source material, and this whole episode allows Brittany Oldford to spread her wings as the character. Not to mention that the show has had a major step up in production quality. Constant cutting scenes too short is gone, letting the slow moments play out. Chemistry has now been built amongst the cast, so performances feel a lot more subtle and natural. And the show actually begins to allow these characters to differentiate heavily from their source material, which makes the changes of names make a bit more sense. It's from here out where storylines are able to take similar concepts to their original episodes and simply use them as a jumping off point to tell almost entirely new stories. So much so that by episode 4, I was legitimately enjoying MTV Skins without even thinking about the original show. And it somehow only went up from there. The cinematography is good, the jokes are funny, even the original score was improving. Am I losing my mind? Is there a fucking gas leak in here? I have to wonder if the fans who are vocally against the MTV show actually gave the entire season a chance, or if they're one of the millions who jumped ship after episode 1, which I frankly can't blame them for. I can't speak for anyone else, but the change between episodes 1 to 4 and 5 is night and day. With both the writers and the cast now settling into this interpretation, you'd think that the ratings would align, but much like the show itself, they told a very different story. MTV Skins pilot had 3 million viewers, which is triple the amounts of the original series pilot, which just goes to show how many newcomers MTV expected to tap into, only for the second episode to have half of that. By episodes 5 and 6, Skins had reached an all-time low of viewership, less than 500,000 viewers for both episodes. Which on its own sounds fine. I mean, the original show had far less than that for its entire first season. That is, until you look at the amount of cable subscribers in the US in 2011, and realize that that's only a 0.4 share. Meaning a staggeringly low amount of people with cable were actually tuning into the show. Sure, it was doing better than something like Zack Stone, but was minute compared to the likes of Jersey Shore, which was in its third season and airing at the same time as MTV Skins, and was pulling in 7 million viewers each episode. And the declining viewership would be a problem in and of itself, if it wasn't for the controversy. I was 11 when Skins premiered on MTV, so the controversy is something I'm only learned about now secondhand as an adult. And from what I can piece together, it seems that a group known as the Parents Television Council, or PTC, the entertainment equivalent to the Homeowners Association, claimed that MTV Skins was not appropriate for teenagers. I should mention that the PTC sort of had it out for MTV throughout the 2000s, constantly proclaiming that they were showing violent, profane smut to kids, going so far as to have the completely original thought that rap is going to ruin the children. Guys, I think you're a couple decades late on that discourse. Beavis and Butt-Head at NWA were well off the air at that point. Regardless of their history, something seemed to stick with Skins, mainly due to the very young age of the cast, and the PTC called for a federal investigation over violations of child porn laws and a full boycott of the series' advertiser, Taco Bell. They hit the fucking spicy potato stuffed tacos. I'd like to take a second here to say that I hope every single member of the PTC will have an itch in between all of your toes that can never be scratched for the remainder of your days. These claims led to a series of events, including the show getting a TVMA rating, which can be found on both the iTunes and DVD versions of the season. But the worst of which was that multiple companies completely pulled their ads from the show, which is a big no-no, since ad breaks are how programs make any money at all. Now I should know. That'd be really awkward if this video was like unable to be monetized and it's just a black fucking screen. I can't stress enough how bad losing advertisers was for MTV. The controversy actually got the show so much bad press that SNL made a skit about the show with Jesse fucking Eisenberg as Tony. We don't talk about this enough. It's funny now how we've seen this exact same thing happen on sites with user-generated content like YouTube, where they're given titles like the Adpocalypse, and yet it's the same puritanical values that have led to this outrage time and time again. Even as of making this video, there's a very similar Christian group pressuring websites like Steam and itch.io to completely remove NSFW games and developers by claiming they're a threat to children. It's a big hoopla that's reoccurred every few years based on the same moral panics that are completely unfounded and aimed at anything that doesn't align with their viewpoints. And sometimes, in the midst of those outrages, you get martyrs that are made an example of. If the issue was the actual content of the episodes, then why weren't there boycotts when the original show had aired on BBC America in the States well before the MTV show was ever made? Mind you, the original Skins is a lot more risque in so many ways. None of these articles or complaints mention is that while some of the cast were underage, others were actually over the age of 18 when filming began. The rest were 17 years old during the filming of Skins, and realistically the only thing I can think of problems emerging is the sex scenes, but hey, if Superbad can get away with it, why can't Skins, as well as the recreation of this shot from Chris's episode. It's sort of complicated since this very well could have been circumvented by simply covering up Jesse Carrere, or altering the shot, or just not doing this part at all. Yeah, ironically, if the show had simply adapted the concept rather than try to adhere to the British original, it probably would have continued to exist. But it's clear that calling this child mineral is insanely disingenuous and disgusting. Its subject matter is no different than shows like Euphoria or the staggering amount of coming-of-age films depicting underage debauchery. Nevertheless, between the low ratings, advertiser boycott, as well as a TVMA rating, Skins was now much more trouble than it was ever worth, and its fate was sealed long before the cancellation was officially announced. But despite all of the outside problems, the actual show kept getting more interesting. Episode 5 is the closest MTV would ever get to adapting the original series again, with an episode about Stanley that mirrors Sid's episode regarding his home life, with the major difference that Stanley is a lot more reserved in the American series, and the episode itself goes in an entirely new direction involving Stanley's father suing him, which not only feels very American, but it makes his mother leaving them both at the end make a bit more sense. Episode 6 is all about Abood, who's meant to be Anwar, struggling with his feelings for Taya, despite her telling him that she's strictly a lesbian, even though we all know that that's not true, only for Abood to find that out as well. This was a pretty fun episode set in the woods. I don't know, maybe it's the anime fan in me, but there's something about field trip or vacation episodes that are just so fun to me. Episode 7 is also based on the original, since it's all about Michelle, but in MTV Skins, she finds out about Tony's infidelity by catching chlamydia? The episode also focuses on her strained relationship with her mother. In MTV Skins, Michelle's mother was previously shown in a somewhat positive light in past episodes, only to be revealed here as an emotionally immature, absent alcoholic who's really only looking out for herself. And Michelle in the MTV series is a lot more decisive about her relationship with Tony, deciding to completely break it off by the end of this episode, permanently. Episode 8 is all about Daisy, who's kind of based on Jal, so it makes sense for this episode to be based on Jal's episode as well, except here it's entirely focused on her relationship with her father after her mother abandons them, as opposed to it simply being a B-plot. And it made for a pretty good episode. Also, her and Abood become friends with benefits, and it's kinda cute, I don't know. Episode 9, Tina, is the most surprising of the bunch, considering the channel that this was released on. Tina is the group's psychology teacher, and much like British Skins Angie, she begins a relationship with the 17-year-old Chris. Despite renaming them all, and there being new scenes as well as new plot threads, not much of the ensemble cast's behavior was changed in MTV Skins. That is, except for two things. Tony is a lot less of a spawn of Satan and just more of a dick, and since the show is now set in high school instead of a college, Chris and Tina's relationship takes a completely new context. Angie in the original series is characterized as desperate and lonely, so her relationship with Chris, while technically legal, is still incredibly sad and predatory. And it makes her out to be a character who is so childish that she completely loses sight of the fact that she's the adult here, and it just makes her all the more pathetic. Meanwhile, in the MTV series, she's not only pathetic and childish, but a pedophile, something the MTV show has no problem depicting her as clear as day. I can only describe episode 9 as an unstoppable freight train running off the tracks that any well-adjusted adult would have not gotten themselves onto at all. And while I wish Tina stayed in jail at the end, this is a much more fitting ending for her character than the original show. Good riddance. In the final episode, Yura is pretty alright, reuniting the friend group after their fallout with Tony in episode 7, and while I'm not trying to pick which is better, I will say that the conclusion in MTV Skins feels a lot more holistic and meant to be satisfying, while UK Skins' ending is very British. I'm just glad that the MTV series tied up most of its hanging threads. Almost everyone's coupled up. Chris ends up staying with Stanley after his predator is forced to stay away from children for the foreseeable future. Tony makes up with almost everybody, and the final webisode sets up his little sister, Yura, a stand-in for Effie, becoming a main character in a non-existent second season, much like the original show. And just like that, MTV Skins ended just as quickly as it started. There are some other comedic webisodes which work as short-form intermediate scenes that expand on the cast, but yeah, Skins US was over. Once the ads were pulled, there was no hope for the show. Without trying to sound like a guy who likes capitalism a little too much, money is what makes the entertainment business go round, and once that stops, something has to change. Immediately. Like any other cancelled show on the network, Skins was swept under the rug by MTV. Except they ended up going above and beyond. Trailers, ads, and interviews were all pulled offline. The series was released on iTunes eventually, like most of their other cancelled shows, and surprisingly it got a physical release that uncensored most of the cursing, except for the fuck word, which... It's TVMA, you could say the word! Once the show was cancelled, focus on the fandom was shifted back to the original series, which had just finished airing its 5th season, and was gearing up for its 6th in January of 2012. And that was kind of it. Some of the cast went on to be in other projects, namely Sophia D'Elia went so far as to get her own sitcom that lasted 2 seasons, but most of the main cast stopped acting altogether. A show that was meant to take amateur actors and propel them into the spotlight much like the original show did, ended up falling short, leaving it with little to no legacy whatsoever. I don't think that it's an unpopular opinion to say that MTV made a mistake being the channel to greenlight the American show. At this point in time, they thought that they could take well-received foreign shows like Skins or The In-Betweeners and adapt them in America to capitalize on the market here, which was very lucrative. In the 2000s, you see, the problem is that MTV didn't pay attention to how these shows were made popular on the internet. Clips were being uploaded to YouTube, and by 2012, the official Skins channel was uploading entire episodes of the UK show completely free. The first place I watched Doctor Who or The In-Betweeners wasn't BBC America on cable. It was Netflix, the same place that many other people discovered Skins in the States for years, up until its removal in 2020. It's no myth that this is where television had been going, not only to avoid the difficulties of overseas licensing and ad boycotts, but because a $15 monthly subscription is easier to sell than a channel upgrade, especially with cable plummeting in popularity. The point is that the age of cable being the primary source of entertainment for not just teenagers, but most of the general public, was already dwindling. And in the years since 2011, cable companies have just lost millions and millions of subscribers every year. What's frustrating is that, had MTV made this just a few years later as a streaming exclusive, I doubt that most of the issues present would have been a major problem. Need I remind you that I saw the original cut of 13 Reasons Why Season 1? Get it? Get it? Because the end of the fucking world, sex education, fucking Euphoria, all of that equally and in some cases much more explicit material than either Skins series. Granted, I've only seen season 1 of the UK show, so please don't spoil the other seasons for me. Especially in a post-Sam Levinson world, it's hard to see what's so objectionable about MTV's Skins. But the real kicker is that, had MTV waited, there would have been no need for a stateside alternative since Skins was already available on BBC America, and all 7 seasons of the show would be put on Netflix in around 2013. The main selling point of MTV's rendition was that it was made available on cable, with a cast and setting a bit more identifiable to American teenagers. Except that's sort of not really viable when the original is all available on the same cheaper platform, especially in 2025 where the borders separating which country gets to contribute to pop culture have been blurred through the internet. A show like MTV Skins makes no sense for any time period except 2011, sticking it in this weird cultural limbo, something that goes for a lot of the channel's cancelled programming. This video began as an oddly aggressive chastising for MTV's cancelled British remakes, since they also made a remake of The In-Betweeners, but I refuse to watch 2 of these things. I've done enough. Thankfully, I ended up discovering a not all terrible show, one that ultimately crumbled under its own legacy and requirement to make a profit. However, had it not been made, I don't think any other version of it would have ever existed. As quickly as it ended up being erased, all the dominoes had to fall right in place for it to even exist at all. Is it the last gasp of a bygone era? Sure, and that's fine enough. If you're willing to give it a try, maybe don't compare and contrast it to its source material, and instead give a second chance to a show that never properly got a first one.
Hey, lately been on that fucking nigga shit. Take a nigga bitch and then I pass her to the click. I say, see me, I don't got no time for no bitch. I just get her for the bros, I'm just worried about them chips. I'm a shot call, little nigga, I'ma stay wild. Hot nigga, I belong in a dog pound.